Welcome to the History of Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Buddy Levy is back, ladies and gentlemen. Empire of Ice and Stone. Great book, but before we get to it, nerds, we got to talk. We're really going to talk. So as you'll notice, I say hello, nerds, very differently in Season 2 than I did in Season 1. And I thought there was a few people came to me and said, I don't like how you say hello, nerds. It kind of creeps me out. You're being weird. Stop doing that. First of all, I am weird. I don't appreciate that. But I took that advice. I took that suggestion, and we changed it up for Season 2. What I did not realize is the backlash that would happen from changing Hello Nerds, because people are also pissed that I don't say Hello Nerds the same way. We need to figure this out. So, once this podcast goes up, this episode, I'm going to ask you in the announcements on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, which one do you prefer, nerds? I want to hear from you. You got to let us know. You got to give us guidance. We got to put this together once and for all. We can't just fall apart like this. A civil war between nerds, it would just be ridiculous. I digress. Buddy Levy is back for the second episode with History of Nerds United. It was a great conversation. Buddy's a really good time talking about adventures. This one in the Arctic again. He's gotten into the Arctic stuff. He kills it. It's a great book. So I'm going to shut up and let's talk to him. Buddy Levy, he's back. And here we are, back with Buddy Levy, coming back for the second time. New book, Empire of Ice and Stone, The Disastrous and Heroic Voyage of the Karluk. Buddy, thank you so much for coming back.
Brandon, it's my pleasure. Great to be here.
Listen, let's start off with the really important stuff. I love the book, and it's very important, but you became a grandfather for the first time since we last talked, right?
That's true. Yeah. During COVID, May of 2020. And I was fortunate because my grandson, Luke, by the way, I dedicated the book to him. My grandson, Luke, was born in a hospital just behind me where I'm sitting right now, about 100 yards away, but I couldn't get into the room. My wife was able to be there. I couldn't get into the room because of COVID restrictions. So there's a great picture of me that we posted on social media where I'm standing outside the window with my bicycle helmet on, and my daughter and son-in-law are holding the baby, and I'm touching the glass, one of those great defining COVID shots. But we were very fortunate to have him spend the first year of his life here in my town. So I got to hang out with him and really bond. And thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, he's a huge defining part of my life.
It's just funny the way COVID changed a lot of things, because it used to be back in the day, no one could go in the delivery room. So, right, the men are supposed to sit outside, smoke cigars like in the 40s and 50s, and we're right back to it.
My daughter and I are really close. She might have let me in, but it worked out really well. But yeah, it was interesting because, you realize how precious that time is. And that moment where I first got to hold him, was probably, I'd say 3 or 4 days later when they went home. And, it was sort of melts you. Being a grandparent is great. I highly recommend it.
Not too soon, though, for me. I'm going to try and hold that off as long as possible.
You're right. Depends on one's age. Yeah.
Now, second very important thing, I want to say congratulations. You finally made it. You were mocked on John Oliver's TV show. I mean, it's got to feel good, right?
Yeah, well, that was really funny. So I like to point out that I've been mocked more than once. When the show that I was on History Channel came out, it was called Decoded, Brad Meltzer's Decoded. And when that show initially aired in 2010, there was a New York Times review, and it said, the reviewer said, and I quote, "One of the cast is some guy named Buddy Levy who could be a bus driver, but is really a professor of writing at Washington State University." And I thought that was actually uncharitable to all the bus drivers in the world. Fast forward a decade or so later, I started getting these texts from friends, and they're like, "Have you seen this?" And I'm like, "What? No, what?" And they said, John Oliver just made fun of you on his show. And I go on there, and, he did a really good job. It was hilarious, and I highly recommend watching it. It was about we did an episode on the History Channel show I was on about the Georgia Guidestones, and John Oliver has some fun with me saying that, a middle-aged man can actually count to 10. It's really great. Thanks for bringing that up.
No problem. Well, listen, I like to always go back to Reggie Jackson. They don't boo nobodies.
Exactly. Yeah. And subsequently, someone blew up the Georgia Guidestones or destroyed them since this has all gone down. So it's hard to know whether, he has quite a following. I don't think they've ever figured out who did it, but some vandals people who were, just conspiracy theorists who were mad about it. And I don't know if they blew it up. They knocked them over or something.
Well, I mean, they're damaged, which means you might very well be the last middle-aged white man that can go over there and count them.
Right. Yeah, it was funny. These things come back to haunt you.
Well, something that's not going to haunt you, the book. What drew you to the story of the Karluk?
Oh, yeah. Great question. So, yeah, you mentioned the last time we talked, I had just finished Labyrinth of Ice, which is the story of the Greeley expedition. And during the research that I was doing for the Greeley expedition, I had come across this story about the Karluk. And, it was in a different part of the Arctic. It was above North America. And it was above Canada and Alaska versus over there in Greenland and Ellesmere Island area. And so it wasn't related. So I saw the thumbnail sketch of the story and I was like, wow, this is remarkable, but I had to file it away in a folder on my computer and was like, okay, I'll maybe return to that sometime. I have to say that I had also been interested in Arctic exploration from the time I first went to Greenland. And so when I found this story of the Karluk and then I revisited it, my agent and my editor were like, hey, you seem to have a knack for this Arctic stuff. Do you have any other stories in your quiver? And I was like, well, actually, let me dust off this one. So I went back and I started reading more extensively about the Karluk expedition, or the Canadian Arctic expedition and the ship, the Karluk. And I was like, oh my God, this has everything that you would ever want in an adventure story. And so I ended up pitching that to my editor and I wrote a short proposal and he was intrigued. And he also had actually done a book by William McKinley, who is a main figure in the expedition. And he had done a republishing of that book like 20 years ago. So my editor was already kind of knowledgeable about this story. And he wanted to see what my treatment of it might look like. And Empire of Ice and Stone is the result of that couple of year journey.
I remember in the last episode you had talked, right? You have the Arctic part down. And I remember you said, I like to keep my stories in that particular book, right, about the boys, not take yourself away or worry about all the other stuff going on around the globe about it. This one is even more into your wheelhouse in that perspective, although we can't say boys because
right.
It's not just boys. Was that something else that really drew this to you because you could keep laser focused on the people in the Arctic and just go straight through?
Yeah, that's a great observation, Brendan, because while I do think the historical context and what's going on globally matters, the people that are on the expedition are so interesting themselves. And the travails that they're experiencing are so difficult and the hardships. And I also have to say that they left really extensive diaries and journals. And so you can get into the minds of the people that were going through this. I end up spending a great deal of time, as you say, developing them as characters. It's almost as if, even though it happened and even though it's nonfiction, I try to treat it like they're characters in a novel. And I try to pace it like it's a riveting adventure novel, which it basically is a riveting adventure story that really happened. But the characters themselves, I try to bring them fully fledged to the page so that we understand their fears, their triumphs, their vulnerabilities, and also, sometimes their machinations. A few of them, there's a bit of mutiny in this story. Some of the members, they reveal that they're worried they're going to die on almost a daily basis. And so, yeah, I really do like to be laser focused, as you say, on the people who were involved in the voyage and what's happening to them on a daily basis. Because I think readers, they like to immerse themselves in, and they can see themselves in some of the characters. They start to identify with particular ones, and that is really important.
Well, let's set up the expedition. All right. Basically, everything revolves around Robert Bartlett and, I'm going to butcher this name, Vilhjalmur Stefansson?
That's really close. Vilhjalmur Stefansson. Yeah, so you're really astute to point out that, this story in many ways is a tale of two leaders. It's framed that way, because there are two significant really prominent figures. Robert Bartlett, who is hired on by Stephenson to be the captain and ice master of the Karluk. And then Stephenson, who is this impresario, this really persuasive, very experienced Arctic explorer, but also he's sort of got a mind toward marketing and PR, and he's very savvy about the way that you can use the media to garner more money from governments and institutions like the American Museum of Natural History and get backing, because these expeditions, of course, were really expensive and you needed to have sponsors and patrons to put up the money. So you've got this guy, Bartlett. He's a Newfoundland mariner who comes from this really revered family of mariners in Brigus, Newfoundland. And, he spent pretty much his entire life at sea. He went on a number of the North Pole expeditions with Robert Peary, including the very controversial last one in which Peary claimed to have made it to the North Pole. And Robert Bartlett was leader of the pioneer party that set up the igloos and trekked ahead and broke the trail for Peary. And Bartlett had to turn back. When he was within 150 miles of the North Pole, Bartlett was asked by Peary to turn back, and in a very controversial decision. And Peary ends up taking Matthew Henson, an African-American explorer. And I say controversial because to this day, Peary's claim of the North Pole remains disputed. And had he taken Bartlett along, I make the case that it might have been less disputed, because Bartlett was a very revered and known, respected navigator, and he knew how to take readings, and he would have had more accurate readings. I opened the book with Stephenson and a bit of background on him, and the fact that he's now the orchestrator of this massive, really ambitious Canadian Arctic expedition. And then Robert Bartlett, who receives a telegram from Stephenson saying, will you come and be the master navigator and captain of the Karluk? And then I bring those two together, where they convened initially in British Columbia, but then up in Alaska. And then it's a story of how these two men basically deal with adversity that's thrown their way.
I don't think it's a spoiler to say things kind of go to hell.
Yeah.
I think you can break Arctic and Antarctic explorations into two camps. There's the camp where we're European, we're not going to listen to a word of what the native people have to say, and we're probably going to freeze to death. And then there's, hey, they know what they're doing. They live here. We should take a few lessons from them. For this expedition, do they lean one way or the other?
Yeah, that's a great observation. I mean, I think Vilhjalmur Stephenson makes a number of disastrous decisions in terms of his organizational skills, in terms of trying to get this thing all together. But the one thing he does that was a stroke of brilliance was to hire on. He fully understood. He had just come back from spending 4 years in the Arctic, living among the Inuit people round the northern coast of Alaska and near at Point Barrow. He hires on a Inupiat family that is a husband named Kuruluk, his wife Kiruk, who gets nicknamed Auntie, and then their two children, Helen and Mugpi, and two other native hunters. Bringing them ends up saving everybody's lives. They didn't know it at the time. But so Auntie, as an example, was hired on to sew Arctic clothing, and she's an expert at sewing parkas and trousers and mucklucks and mittens, which are absolutely essential in the conditions, that are going to be minus 50 below and colder than that with the wind chill and traveling across the frozen polar seas. And then the men's abilities to hunt, to get seals, to build igloos, and to run the sled dogs, those are all vital, essential. And the European scientists, mainly they're from a number of places, but on the Karluk there are a number of scientists who have virtually no experience in travel across the polar ice. And so having these Inuit people along is essential. And then, of course, they end up becoming shipwrecked. It's funny. I always tell my editor, I'm like, I don't want to give away the book. And he's like, look at the cover. The ship is screwed. So it's not like this is a big mystery that they're going to have mishaps. And I'm like, oh, yeah, you're right. So, they end up becoming shipwrecked. And end up marooned on this island above 100 miles above northern Siberia. And again, the ingenuity and the skill and the knowledge of the Inuit people who are there with them is absolutely vital to the survival of those who do survive. And I will tell you that not everyone survives.
You really hammer this home where a lot of books will run over it. Anti-sewing, it wasn't just like, oh, I ripped this, I'm going to hand this to her to sew it. She wakes up, she sews. If she's not fixing something that's broken, she's creating a new one because everything's about to fall apart. To say it was a full-time job for her, I think, doesn't even do it justice. And like you said, it's absolutely vital to them living.
Right. I mean, and one thing is that they did bring aboard piles and piles of skins, of reindeer skins and bear skins. And so the process of making this clothing is very painstaking, time consuming, and labor intensive. And so there's a point at which, and I'll just say that early on, the ship becomes encased in ice and it's blown offshore and blown out to sea and encased in this 1.5 mile square of ice. And it's not able to move under its own power. And during that time, they're floating for months, drifting and being blown by wind and current. Auntie is actually teaching some of the other members of the crew and the scientists how to sew because she can't do it all herself. And, she is, you're right, like hours and hours a day, preparing these skins, treating them, drying them, and then using sinew to sew them. And she makes literally hundreds of boots because she understands that once they're out, if they get crushed and they have to be moving along the Arctic sea ice, it's sharp and gnarly and it's going to tear up the footwear and they're going to need spares.
And as we're talking about these characters, we'll go back to Bartlett and Stephenson. We won't talk too much about what their fates are and what happens along the way, because there is that one little twist at the beginning that kind of shows you who these guys are. But when you look at them, is it kind of a dream for a writer that one of them goes full hero and one of them goes kind of the villain side of things? I think you try and give the reasons why he might have made some decisions he did. But is it easier for a writer when you can say, I got the dark and the light right here, I just have to highlight it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, listen, I'm happy to talk about what happens because it happens pretty early. So what you're referring to, of course, is that after the ship becomes encased in ice, after maybe 4 to 6 weeks of drifting, Stephenson is still on the ship and he makes this fateful decision to take 2 of the best hunters, 12 of the best dogs, and a couple of the scientists and strike for land on what he calls a caribou hunt. So he essentially abandons the ship. He says he's going to be back within 10 days to 2 weeks, but a massive storm hits them. And by the way, this is in mid-September of 1913, and then a full-on winter blizzard hits them. So we've got this situation where Stephenson, because of the decisions that he makes later, begins to surface as the villain of this tale, and Bartlett, because of the actions that he takes to attempt to save the ship and then also to very courageous acts to try to get the remaining members to this remote island above northern Siberia, and then a journey that he goes on, he surfaces as the hero. And I don't know that it's necessarily easier, but people will show you who they are if you spend enough time with them. And I do make the case that Stephenson is more complicated than strictly a villain because he goes on to do a great deal of science that is worthy, and he is a major figure in Arctic exploration. But within the context of the Karluk tale, I do think he is more villainous, certainly, than Bartlett is, who just is fairly selfless throughout. He risks his life on numerous occasions for the others.
You've done a lot of research on this, obviously, to write this book. Do you think Stephenson planned on going back to the boat, or did he look at it and say, this thing is screwed, let me get as far away from here as possible?
Well, yeah, the circumstances make that a little hard to definitively determine because there's a letter. He writes a letter to Bartlett and says, I will be back within 10 days to 2 weeks if no accident occurs. That's how he phrases it. And then he even tells Bartlett to bank up large coal fires next to the ship and create a bunch of smoke so that he can find his way back. I mean, this is a vast area and there's optical illusions out there and it's hard to see. So I think he's considering coming back, but what ends up happening is, he gets stranded on a small island. Stephenson gets stranded on a small island, and this massive storm comes. When the fog lifts and he gets up in this little driftwood observation tower they built, he's like, dude, where's my ship? It's gone. So at that point, he reacts in a way that he's not going to go back out onto the ice just looking for this ship that he knows is probably drifting pretty fast. So he's close to shore, the Alaskan northern coast. And so he just makes his way. When the ice freezes up again, he goes across, and then we cut to the members of the Karluk and spend most of our time with Bartlett and the remaining survivors on the Karluk and what they're doing.
Now, with the much less research that I've done, but I have read a couple of books on the Karluk, I feel like he got away from the ship and said, if all of a sudden things look like they're going to be a lot better, I'll go back. But if it kind of stays the way it is, I'm just going to make up whatever I need to and just head on back to shore. That's just my thoughts.
Yeah, well, there's something else that I mentioned that not many people have brought up, which is that Vilhjalmur Stephenson, from his previous expeditions, he had a native wife and young son who were living not far from where he ends up marooned on this tiny little island. And he very quickly goes to them. And so, it seems to me that he knew, he had a young son and a wife in the sense that they weren't like legally married, but it's considered a native spouse, And so he ends up going directly to them. And so my theory is that he figured, given the conditions, that he might as well go see them. And he had planned to bring them along on his subsequent expedition, but he doesn't do that. And that's another thing, he just abandons them ultimately and never sees them again, and which is another thing that I thought was sort of bad form on his part,
Yeah, I walked away from the book thinking this dude sucks. But on the other side, we got Bartlett. He's got to keep this crew together. And this is not a Shackleton situation, right, where he's in complete control. Everybody's looked at him from the leader for day one. Like, he's going to take over when Stephenson takes off. And also, a lot of times with Arctic exploration, they're military explorations, which means it's much easier. Here's the chain of command. You got to do what you got to do. Bartlett really had his hands full on this one, didn't he?
You're absolutely right. In my previous book, Labyrinth of Ice, as you say, it was a very strict military expedition that had a chain of command and really was, without question, the commander. And people had to do what he said. Mutiny was punishable by execution. In fact, an execution occurs in the Labyrinth of Ice story, the Greeley expedition. Bartlett has a bigger problem and a more complicated one in a lot of ways because Stephenson, the expedition leader, has left the ship. Bartlett is the ship's captain. And now it is true that ship's captains have a great deal of authority. They're ultimately in charge of what goes on the ship and who does what. But there are a number of scientists that are still on the ship who were hired by Stephenson. They're under the aegis of Stephenson and not Bartlett. So he can't exactly tell them what to do. And then there's a bunch of crew members who he has a bit more authority over because there's a pecking order and the captain is in charge and the crew has to do what he says. Or if they mutiny, then you've got a situation. But it does end up being really complicated because some of the members that were hired by Stephenson who had been with Shackleton on the Nimrod expedition, they decide to go off on their own, and Bartlett can't do that much about it. He actually supports them and tells them that he'll give them resources in terms of food and dogs. They end up not wanting the dogs, which is a big mistake, and they go out onto the ice by themselves, man-hauling sleds with their shoulders, and you just see them, heading off into the buckled, broken, fissuring ice. I'll just say it doesn't go that well for them. But yeah, Bartlett had a lot of responsibility, and he ends up doing these remarkable things, including leading everyone over 100 miles across the ice to this island, Wrangel Island. and then making a very hard decision to go on this journey or voyage that may end up being 1,000 miles long with only one Inuit member, Kadoktovik. And that is just a remarkable voyage and journey on its own.
How would you compare that one to Shackleton's endurance situation, where there was a lot of stuff that can go wrong? It's now two men out in the Arctic, and they're deciding, yeah, like you said, quite a few miles. And I mean, not to be that guy that talked about the last place he just visited, but I just got back from Iceland.
Awesome.
We did a walk on a glacier, had crampons on and everything. And I walked like 50 feet and I'm like, damn, I'm not in the best shape ever, but this is tiring. And I'm thinking, I don't have sledges on me. I don't have a backpack on me. This is just walking across ice is no freaking joke. And I think about Bartlett just saying, okay, I'm just going to keep walking south across God knows what ice. It's insane, right? This is one of the greatest journeys ever.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It could be one of the most underrated or unknown journeys in Arctic exploration history. And what ends up happening is that once Bartlett gets the members of the shipwrecked Karluk across the ice to Wrangel Island, they're in really terrible condition. Many of them are hypothermic. They have frostbite. They're malnourished. They've only been able to bring a certain amount of the food from the ship with them because it's so heavy to get across. And the other thing to remember is that the ice isn't flat like a frozen lake. It's buckled, and there are these pressure ridges where giant plates, it's kind of like tectonic plates of ice where they come together, they rupture and create these massive ridges. Some of them are over 100 feet high. They have to hack their way through these ridges with pickaxes. So they get to Wrangel Island, and then Bartlett realizes that no one in the world knows where they are. Okay, the whaling industry is in decline. No one's coming. And also it's now February, March, and the place is essentially frozen. At that time in 1913, 14, there was a window of about 6 weeks max where there's open water around the island that you can get to them. So Bartlett understands all this, and he realizes, I can only stay here for like 2 days, and then I have to go on this journey with this Kadoktovik hunter, 19-year-old guy, to a place he's never been, across this long strait, which is about 100 miles of buckled, fissured, ruptured, and moving ice, and hopefully get to northern Siberia, where he might be able to meet people and buy or barter for dog sled teams and get all the way to the end of northeastern Siberia, where he can then maybe go across the Bering Strait and get to Alaska and send news to the world that there are these survivors stranded on Wrangel Island. It could be a book in itself, really. It's quite a journey. And one of the problems that people don't really know about or think about is when you crossing this ice and it's moving, it's a constant, it's kind of like a jigsaw puzzle of ice pieces that are moving and sometimes freezing and knitting together, and then other times separating, often under the igloo that you're sleeping in, and just fracturing and opening up, and then it's open water underneath. And so you have to sleep in your clothes and then scramble to a safe piece of ice somewhere. And so they're having to cross all these open leads and throw the dogs over. And not to mention, they have dead seals on their sleds and they're being tracked by polar bears along the way. It's quite an ordeal.
The other thing about ice that you hear at every Arctic exploration, oh yeah, they went 3 miles east, but the ice went 4 miles west while they were doing that. So they actually lost a mile, no matter how hard they were trying.
Right. It's almost impossible to travel in a straight line. So Bartlett and Kadoktovik had this pretty interesting technique where when they would come to an open lead of water, one of them would start down one direction, let's say to the west, the other would go to the east. And when they came to a place where it was narrow enough to cross, one of them would walk up onto a little hummock or pressure ridge and raise a pistol and fire it, which suggested, I've found a place to cross. Then the other guy would have, and sometimes these were a couple miles away, and the other guy would have to get the dog sled going, drag all their gear, meet up with Kadoktovik, and then they'd have to cross these leads and then maybe go a mile or two south toward Siberia, and then it would happen again and again. So it takes them a really long time to get from Wrangel Island across this 100-mile gauntlet of ice.
Now, we rightly bring up how important Bartlett is and how hardcore he is, quite frankly. But if he doesn't have Kadatovic, he doesn't survive, right? Like, if he has to bring another European with him, they aren't going to make it.
Absolutely not. I mean, first of all, Kadatovic, saves him on multiple occasions where Bartlett either falls waist deep into the water. A couple times they do things that are really, really unbelievable. Like they come to a place where there's this big ice chunk in the open water, and they use their rifles, and they have these long bamboo poles that have multi-uses. They can be used for canvas over igloo roofs, or they can be used to spur the dogs on. But they also put them across stretches of open water and then shimmy across them. And a couple times, Kadatovic has to tether Bartlett to this rope to his waist, and then he gets across, and then he drags Bartlett across at high speed, and Bartlett's like skiffing across these poles over the open water. It's really intense.
It's insane that anybody survives, but obviously, since we have the story, at least a few do. Is there a lot of similarities between the Greeley expedition, or did you see this as almost, because in a way, I'm just trying to think out loud, Greeley made a lot of mistakes along the way, right? Where ultimately he did some good things, he did some bad things. It seems like Bartlett got a lot more right than wrong when it came to his leadership style. That's my thoughts. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. They're very different in that because the Karluk drifts off and it heads into the Arctic Ocean, Stephenson knows from previous expeditions the general direction that it is heading, but it's so vast that there's no way of understanding where it might be or even if it got crushed. So one of the differences is that in the Greeley expedition, the U.S. government has a general idea, at least where Fort Conger is, and there was a plan. There was a really defined and orchestrated and written plan of where the Greeley members were supposed to be and when. Now, of course, that all gets scuttled when Greeley decides to leave Fort Conger and trek and head south toward Cape Sabine and the Smith Sound. So there's some similarities in that you've got a group of people who are marooned essentially, and they need outside help to survive. In Empire of Ice and Stone, what's really fascinating to me is that once Bartlett leaves, again, so you've got a bunch of people still on this island, Wrangel Island. And so they have to figure out, it's kind of like Lord of the Flies, but on a frozen Arctic island, right? So how will they survive? Will they share food? Will they be able to work together to get the limited resources that are available to them? You know, there are some seals, there's shorebirds that are nesting in these cliffs. You've got a few walrus that come around in the spring. And then Bartlett is on his own epic odyssey. So you're cutting back and forth between Bartlett and his trek to get help, and then the survivors on Wrangel Island and how they're going to fare. So, yeah, I mean, there are some similarities in that you've got people who are marooned, but they're quite different in that in Empire of Ice and Stone, no one knows where they are. And unless Bartlett can get to civilization and get the word, they're all going to die.
I can't help but thinking, especially multiple times in this book, and we mentioned it, having the Inuit there saves their lives on multiple occasions. At the same time, I can't help but think when these stories end and there's any Inuit involved, right? You find out towards the end, like, oh, this person died and this happened, and this one just barely made it. And the Inuits are kind of like, yeah, we're fine. Like, this sucks, guys, but it's the Arctic. What did you expect? Like, they're completely immersed in this, and even under the worst circumstances, they just seem to kind of take it in stride, no matter what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't a lot of panic. There's this great scene in which they're crossing from this place called Shipwreck Camp, and Kurluk and his wife and two kids are in an igloo, and then the ice ruptures beneath the igloo. And they get out, and I mean, there's a massive storm is going. It's like cataclysm everywhere, the sounds of the rupturing ice. And they walk to a safe place and just start building another igloo, right? And then Kurluk is such a good hunter that I don't think he ever feels like he's going to die because he knows how to get seal. And Auntie is so good at using every single part of the seal that, she can make skin clothing. And then they can eat every part, and they use the blubber in various ways. And so they're less concerned, I think, about being able to survive another winter, whereas the European and white members of this expedition are not nearly as suited to the conditions, let's say.
Well, I think we hit it pretty hard how epic, and I mean, there are multiple epic stories in here. There's a lot of people who don't want to read history, buddy. I know they exist, but we got to deal with it, right?
Fools, yeah.
But, I get it, right? Because when you're in history class and you get just everything's getting shoved down your throat, you're like, history is boring. It's something that I'm required to memorize in school. If one of those people was in front of you today and said, I don't read history, that was something I only did in school, why should I read your book? What would you say to them?
Yeah, well, first I would say they're probably reading the wrong history. History is so much more than dates and when things happened. To me, it's about stories and about people. And I would say the reason to read Empire of Ice and Stone is that you've got, hardship and survival on the frozen polar seas, shipwreck and mutiny, frostbite and a possible murder, privation, starvation, a dramatic rescue attempt in one of the harshest places in the world, sacrifice, courage, camaraderie, and what else is there?
I think you got everything. That checked all the boxes right there. Well, buddy, listen, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on. And then I guess we'll see you as soon as you get that next one out. You're going to get working on it.
Yeah, I'll get cracking, and we'll talk to you if not before, in a couple of years when my next book, Realm of Ice and Sky, drops.
Perfect.
Thanks for having me.
And that is it for this episode, buddy. Thank you once again for coming on. Nerds, hit us up. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I say it every time. Come on out. Listen, find us on whatever podcast, whatever you're listening to us on right now. All right? 5 stars. Give it to us. Leave a little write-up about how much you love this stuff, right? Send us emails. Tell us what you want. Tell us what you don't want. You have an author you think is awesome and you want to hear me interview him? Tell me. I'll try and do it. We'll figure it out. All right? Until next time, nerds, stay cool.